factory, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Let me tell you how I went from homeless widow to the woman holding all the cards. 2 months ago, I was Margaret Thompson, devoted wife of 43 years and mother to one spectacularly ungrateful daughter. When Harold died of a heart attack at 72, I thought my world was ending, but I had no idea that my real journey was just beginning. Elizabeth swooped in during my grief like a vulture in designer clothes, cooing about how difficult this must be for me, how I couldn't possibly manage this big house alone at 65, how the stairs and maintenance and all those memories weren't healthy for someone in my condition. I should have seen the calculation behind her concern, the way her eyes lingered on the antique furniture and expensive artwork that had filled our home for decades. Elizabeth had always been Harold's favorite, his little princess who could do no wrong. And when she married that investment banker, Richard, and started producing grandchildren, Harold doted on them all while I remained in the background, the woman who cooked and cleaned and kept everything running smoothly, practically invisible in my own home. After the funeral, Elizabeth became increasingly insistent about my situation, bringing Richard over for family dinners where they would corner me with real estate pamphlets and retirement community brochures, speaking to me like I was a child who couldn't understand basic concepts. "Mom, these places are wonderful," she would say, her voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "You would have people your own age, activities, no responsibilities, no worries about maintaining this enormous house that's really too much for someone your age." What they meant was no inheritance to split, no inconvenient mother to deal with, no obstacles between them and what they saw as their rightful claim to Harold's wealth. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but ended with my entire world collapsing. I had been living in what Elizabeth now called our house for 6 weeks since Harold's death, still sleeping in the guest room because I couldn't bear to pack up our bedroom, still going through the motions of maintaining a home that no longer felt like mine. Elizabeth arrived unannounced with Richard and 2 large suitcases, her usual perfect composure replaced by something harder, more determined. "Mom, we've made a decision," she announced without preamble. "Richard got the promotion we've been hoping for, and we need to move into town immediately. This house is perfect for our family's needs." I stared at her, not quite comprehending what she was suggesting, the words not making sense in the context of everything I thought I knew about my life. "Move in?" I managed to ask. "But this is my home, Elizabeth. This is where your father and I built our life together." Elizabeth's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation. Underneath that, I had somehow missed for all these years. "Actually, Mom, according to Dad's will, I inherited everything. The house, the investments, all of it. I've been letting you stay here out of kindness, but it's time for you to find your own place and start your own life." The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping and struggling to understand how everything I had believed about my future had been a lie. "Elizabeth, surely there's been some mistake," I whispered, but she was already shaking her head with the certainty of someone who had planned this conversation carefully. "No mistake, Mom. Dad knew I would take better care of his legacy than you ever could. You never understood money or investments or business. You were just the wife. Just the wife. 43 years of marriage, of partnership, of sacrifice, reduced to those 3 dismissive words." But Elizabeth wasn't finished delivering her carefully prepared speech. "Find somewhere else to die," she said, her voice as cold as winter morning. "You're useless now." I packed my things that same day, 43 years of marriage fitting into 2 suitcases and a small box of photographs, while Elizabeth watched from the doorway like a prison guard, making sure I didn't steal anything that belonged to her now. "There's a nice senior complex on Maple Street," she offered with the enthusiasm of someone recommending a decent restaurant. "Very affordable, and I'm sure they have openings for someone in your situation." Affordable. My daughter was supposedly inheriting $33 million, and she was suggesting I check into what was essentially a welfare facility for the elderly, as if I should be grateful for her generosity in even bothering to make the suggestion. Richard loaded my suitcases into their BMW with the efficiency of someone disposing of garbage, never quite meeting my eyes as he handled the remnants of my life. "Margaret, you'll love having your independence again," he said, his voice artificially cheerful. "No more worrying about house maintenance or property taxes or any of those complicated responsibilities. No more home," he meant. "No more sense of belonging anywhere in the world." As we drove away from the house where I had spent 4 decades making a home, hosting Elizabeth's birthday parties, nursing Harold through his final illness, maintaining every detail he cared about, I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror and felt something inside me break. Completely. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had spent all those years creating a sanctuary for my family, only to be ejected from it like an unwanted guest who had overstayed her welcome. The Sunset Inn was exactly what you would expect from a place charging $49 a night. Thin walls, thinner towels, and carpet that had seen better decades, possibly better centuries. Elizabeth handed me $200 in cash like she was tipping a hotel maid. Her generosity, apparently, exhausting her capacity for maternal care. "This should cover you for a few days while you get settled," she said. "I'll have Richard transfer some money into your account once we sort through Dad's paperwork." Some money from my own inheritance, she meant, as if she were doing me a favor by allowing me to access what was supposedly mine. After they left, I sat on the sagging mattress in that depressing motel room and tried to process what had just happened, how my entire life had been dismantled in the span of 3 hours. In one morning, I had gone from grieving widow to homeless senior citizen, discarded by the woman I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for like an expired prescription that was no longer useful to anyone. But as I sat there surrounded by the remnants of my former life, something began nagging at me, a persistent voice in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced by grief and shock. Harold had always been meticulous about his affairs, obsessively, organized about important documents, the kind of man who kept copies of everything in multiple locations and explained his decisions to me in exhaustive detail. He had shown me his will years ago, walking me through every provision, making sure I understood his wishes and his reasoning, and I was absolutely certain that what Elizabeth had described was not what that document had said. Harold had been many things during our marriage, sometimes traditional to the point of being old-fashioned, occasionally stubborn about financial matters, sometimes patronizing about my understanding of investments and business decisions. But he wasn't cruel, and he wasn't vindictive, and the man who had held my hand through my mother's death, who had surprised me with flowers on every anniversary, who had built his entire business around the principle of taking care of people, would never have left me destitute and homeless in my old age. If you're finding this story as shocking as I did living through it, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because trust me, this is just the beginning of how I discovered the truth and got my revenge. The twists coming up will leave you speechless, so don't miss what happens next. The next morning, using the motel's unreliable Wi-Fi connection, I searched for Harold's attorney, Harrison Mitchell, the same lawyer who had handled our house purchase, our business contracts, and various legal matters over the years. His office was downtown, a 20-minute bus ride that cost me precious cash from Elizabeth's meager allowance, but it felt like the most important investment I could make in discovering the truth about my situation. Harrison Mitchell was a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the sort of old-school attorney who still believed in personal relationships and ethical practice. When his secretary announced that Mrs. Thompson was here about her husband's estate, he looked genuinely surprised, as if he had been expecting me for weeks and couldn't understand why I hadn't appeared sooner. "Margaret, my dear," he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk. "I was wondering when you would come in. I tried calling your house several times over the past few weeks, but Elizabeth said you were traveling and would contact me when you were ready to discuss the estate." Traveling. That was what my daughter had told him to explain my absence, as if I had been off on some extended vacation, instead of being systematically defrauded and made homeless. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, my voice barely steady, "I need to ask you about Harold's will. I need to understand exactly what my husband left me." He looked puzzled, the expression of someone who couldn't understand why I was asking about information I should already possess. "Of course, Margaret. Didn't Elizabeth provide you with your copy of the will? I gave her the original and several certified copies after the reading with explicit instructions that you should receive yours immediately." My stomach dropped as the implications hit me like a physical blow. "There was a reading?" I whispered. "Margaret, you were supposed to be there," Harrison said, his concern growing more evident with each word. "Elizabeth said you were too distraught to attend, that she would handle all the details and make sure you received your complete inheritance without having to deal with the legal complexities." The blood drained from my face as I realized the scope of Elizabeth's deception. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, struggling to keep my voice level, "I was never told about any reading. Elizabeth told me she inherited everything, that I was left with nothing, that I needed to find somewhere else to live because the house belongs to her now." Harrison Mitchell's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, and he reached for a thick file folder with movements that suddenly seemed urgent, as if he were dealing with an emergency rather than a routine estate matter. "Margaret, that's impossible," he said firmly. "Your husband's will is very specific about your inheritance, very detailed about his intentions regarding your financial security." He pulled out the document, and I recognized Harold's neat signature at the bottom, witnessed and notarized according to legal requirements. But as Harrison began reading the actual provisions, I realized that Elizabeth had lied about absolutely everything, that her entire story about my inheritance had been a fabrication designed to steal everything Harold had intended for me. "I, Harold James Thompson, being of sound mind and body," Harrison read in his measured professional voice, "do hereby bequeath to my beloved wife Margaret Ann Thompson the following: our primary residence at 847 Elmwood Drive, including all furnishings and personal effects accumulated during our marriage. Additionally, I leave her 70% of all financial assets, investments, and accounts, totaling approximately $23 million. My head started spinning as the numbers sank in. $23 million. The house, 70% of everything Harold had built during his lifetime. I was not the destitute widow Elizabeth had convinced me I was. I was, by any measure, a wealthy woman who had been systematically defrauded by her own daughter. Harrison continued reading, his voice growing more serious as he reached the provisions. Concerning Elizabeth. To my daughter, Elizabeth Thompson Richards, I leave $10 million to be held in trust, with distributions beginning on her 45th birthday, contingent upon her treatment of her mother following my death and her demonstration of mature judgment regarding family relationships and financial responsibility. Contingent upon her treatment of me. Harold had known, somehow, exactly what Elizabeth might try to do if given the opportunity. He had seen something in our daughter that I had missed, or perhaps that I had chosen to ignore because it was too painful to acknowledge. "Mr. Mitchell," I whispered, hardly able to process what I was hearing. "Elizabeth told me I inherited nothing. She moved into my house, gave me $200, and suggested I find a senior facility. She told me to find somewhere else to die." The elderly lawyer's face flushed with anger, and I could see decades of professional experience dealing with family disputes and estate. Fraud. "Margaret, what Elizabeth has done constitutes elder abuse and fraud on multiple levels. She has committed several felonies, but more than that, she has violated the most basic obligations of a daughter to her mother." "But she had legal documents," I protested, still struggling to understand how she could have been so convincing. She showed me papers that looked official, documents that seemed to support everything she was saying. Forged, most likely, Harrison said grimly. Or possibly documents from an earlier draft of the will that your husband had decided to change. Harold updated his will 6 months before his death, specifically because he had become concerned about Elizabeth's attitude toward money, her sense of entitlement, and what he called her disturbing lack of empathy for others less fortunate than herself. The room was spinning as I tried to process 43 years of marriage to a man who had apparently been much more observant about our daughter's character than I had ever realized. All those times Elizabeth had dismissed my opinions, talked over me during family dinners, rolled her eyes when I tried to contribute to conversations about their expensive vacations or Richard's business success. Harold had been watching, evaluating, making quiet decisions about how to protect me from the very behavior I had been too blind to see clearly. "There's more, Margaret," Harrison continued, and I braced myself for another revelation. The trust. Provision for Elizabeth specifically states that if she fails to treat you with respect and dignity following Harold's death, if she attempts to manipulate or defraud you in any way, the entire $10 million reverts to you instead. She doesn't just lose her inheritance, it becomes yours as an additional protection against exactly the kind of behavior she has demonstrated. I stared at him in complete shock, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. "Are you saying that Elizabeth just cost herself $10 million by treating me the way she did?" "I'm saying," Harrison replied with something that might have been satisfaction, "that your daughter's greed and cruelty have backfired spectacularly. You're not inheriting $23 million, Margaret. You're inheriting $33 million, plus the house, plus all personal property, plus whatever additional legal remedies we can pursue for the fraud she has committed against you." The irony was so perfect, it was almost poetic. Elizabeth had been so eager to claim her inheritance, so confident in her ability to manipulate and deceive me, that she had triggered the exact legal provision Harold had included to protect me from her worst impulses. Her greed had cost her everything she thought she was entitled to, while securing my financial future beyond anything I had ever imagined possible. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely steady as I contemplated the enormous change in my circumstances. Harrison smiled, and for the first time since Harold's death, I saw genuine warmth and support directed toward me instead of condescension or calculation. "Now, my dear," he said, "we call the police about the fraud Elizabeth has committed. Then we call Elizabeth and inform her that she is about to receive the shock of her life. After that, we make sure she faces the full consequences of her choices, both legal and financial." "Can she fight this?" I asked, still hardly daring to believe that justice might actually be possible. "With what money?" Harrison replied. "She's about to discover that every account she thought she controlled actually belongs to you. Every investment, every bank account, every asset except the house she's been living in illegally is about to be frozen pending investigation of her fraudulent activities." I thought about Elizabeth in my house, probably already planning renovations, shopping for new furniture with money she believed was hers, making plans for a future built on lies and theft. Richard was probably calculating how their newfound wealth would affect his investment strategies, his business partnerships, his social standing in the community. They had no idea that in a matter of hours, their entire world was going to implode in the most spectacular way possible. Harrison Mitchell's office became what he cheerfully called Command Central for Operation Justice as he contacted the police, the banks, and a private investigator while I sat in his leather chair, still processing the magnitude of Elizabeth's deception and the completeness of Harold's protection. The forged documents she had shown me were quite sophisticated, Detective Rodriguez explained as she reviewed the fake will. "This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime, Mrs. Thompson. Someone planned this very carefully, which means we're dealing with premeditated fraud rather than a simple misunderstanding." "Do you think Elizabeth had help?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Almost certainly," the detective replied. "Creating convincing legal forgeries requires specific knowledge, professional equipment, and connections to people who specialize in this type of document fraud. We'll need to investigate whether Richard or someone in his financial network was involved in the planning and execution." Within 2 hours, every account had been frozen. Every credit card Elizabeth had linked to what she thought were her inheritance funds had been declined, and the utilities for the house, which she had already transferred to her name in preparation for permanent occupancy, were suspended pending verification of legal ownership. It was like watching a controlled demolition of her carefully constructed fraud, each revelation bringing her fake empire crashing down around her. My phone rang at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, Elizabeth's name flashing on the screen with what I now recognized as perfect timing. She was probably calling from the bank, standing in front of some teller who had just informed her that her accounts were frozen and under federal investigation. "Mom, where are you?" she demanded, without any preliminary greeting. "There's some kind of mix-up with the bank accounts. They're saying Daddy's assets are frozen, that there's been some kind of fraud reported. I need you to come down here and clear this up immediately." "Hello, Elizabeth," I said calmly. "I'm sitting in Harrison Mitchell's office. You remember him? Don't you? Daddy's attorney, the one who read the real will to an empty room while you told him I was traveling and too distraught to handle legal matters." Silence. Then, in a voice I had never heard from her before, small and uncertain, "Mom, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but—" "I discovered that you're a liar and a thief, sweetheart," I interrupted. "I also discovered that your father was much smarter than either of us realized, and that he protected me from you in ways I never could have imagined." "You don't understand," she said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. "I was protecting you from the complexity of managing all that money. You've never had to deal with large investments or complicated financial decisions. I was trying to spare you the burden of—" "Elizabeth," I said, cutting off her rehearsed justification, "I understand perfectly. You forged legal documents, committed multiple felonies, and threw your 65-year-old mother out of her own house because you thought I was too stupid and too grief-stricken to discover the truth. The only thing you miscalculated was how much your father knew about your character." Her voice turned sharp and desperate. "Mom, you're confused. The grief has been overwhelming for both of us, and someone is obviously taking advantage of your emotional state to manipulate you into believing things that aren't true." The audacity was breathtaking, even when caught red-handed, even with the evidence of her fraud laid out in black and white. Elizabeth was still trying to manipulate me, still convinced that she could talk her way out of the consequences of her choices. "Elizabeth, dear," I said, and I could hear the steel in my own voice that surprised even me. "Let me clarify something for you. Not only did you never inherit anything from your father, but your actual inheritance, the $10 million he had originally left you, is now mine as well, thanks to a clause he included specifically about treating me with dignity and respect after his death." "That's impossible," she whispered. "Detective Rodriguez is sitting right here if you'd like to discuss the impossibility of fraud charges with her," I replied. "She has some very interesting questions about forged documents and elder abuse that I think you'll find educational." The phone went quiet, and I could almost hear Elizabeth's mind racing, calculating, searching for some angle or manipulation that might still work in her favor. "Mom, please," she said finally. "Can we meet somewhere and talk about this reasonably? I'm sure we can work something out that's fair to everyone." "Oh, we'll definitely be meeting soon," I told her. "At the courthouse, when you're arraigned on fraud charges. I'm looking forward to it. You wouldn't dare press charges against your own daughter." Something cold and final crystallized in my chest, 43 years of being dismissed and underestimated finally reaching their breaking point. "Watch me," I said, and hung up the phone. I looked at Harrison, who was practically beaming with approval at my performance. "How long before she's arrested?" I asked. "Detective Rodriguez has enough evidence for arrest warrants," he replied. "They'll pick her up this evening, probably at the house she's been illegally occupying. Richard's financial records are being subpoenaed as we speak, and if he participated in creating those forged documents, he'll face federal charges as well." My phone buzzed with a text message from Elizabeth. "Mom, please don't do this. Think about the grandchildren. They need their mother." I showed the message to Detective Rodriguez, who smiled grimly. "Classic emotional manipulation," she observed. "Textbook behavior pattern for this type of family financial crime." I typed back, "I am thinking about them. They deserve to see what happens when you steal from family." 20 minutes later, Richard called, his voice artificially calm in the way that suggested panic barely held in check. "Margaret," he said, "surely we can resolve this privately, between family members. Elizabeth made some poor decisions, but involving the police seems excessive given the circumstances." "Richard," I replied, "did you help her forge those documents?" Silence. Then, "Margaret, you have to understand the pressure Elizabeth was under. She was genuinely worried about your mental state, your ability to handle large sums of money responsibly. Her actions weren't malicious, they were protective." "So that's a yes," I said. "You did help her commit federal fraud." "It wasn't like that," he protested. "Elizabeth genuinely believed she was protecting you by taking control of complex financial matters you weren't equipped to handle. By throwing me out of my house and telling me to find somewhere to die." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, please be reasonable about this situation. Consider the broader implications for everyone involved." "I was reasonable for 43 years, Richard," I told him. "It didn't work out very well for me. Now I'm going to try being unreasonable for a change and see how that works instead." The story gets even more incredible from here. And if you're enjoying this tale of justice and revenge, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because the next part involves arrests, courtroom drama, and discoveries that will completely change how you think about family, loyalty, and betrayal. You won't want to miss how this all ends. The police arrested Elizabeth at 8:30 that evening while she was having dinner at Laurent, apparently celebrating her inheritance with Richard and another couple, completely oblivious to the fact that her world was about to come crashing down. According to Detective Rodriguez, she screamed about false arrest and demanded to call her lawyer, who turned out to be Richard's golf buddy with no experience in criminal defense law, a choice that would prove to be yet another miscalculation in a series of increasingly expensive mistakes. Richard was arrested at his office the next morning, just as he was arriving to what he thought would be a normal day of managing other people's investments, completely unaware that federal investigators had been building a case against him for hours. The forensic accountant had traced the forged documents to a printing company Richard's firm used for creating what turned out to be fraudulent investment prospectuses, revealing that my son-in-law had quite an extensive criminal resume that Elizabeth had either never known about or had chosen to ignore in favor of his apparent financial success. I spent my first night back in my house, in the master bedroom, for the first time in 43 years, truly seeing it as mine rather than as Harold's domain that I happened to share. Elizabeth had already moved her belongings into the space, replacing Harold's careful organization. With her chaos of designer clothes and expensive cosmetics, evidence of how quickly she had assumed ownership of everything she thought she had inherited. I packed all of her possessions into garbage bags and left them on the front porch, a symbolic reclaiming of my space that felt more satisfying than I had expected. The house felt different now, not just because Harold was gone, but because I was finally seeing it as a space that could reflect my preferences, my needs, my vision of how I wanted to live. For decades, I had maintained it as Harold's sanctuary, designed around his tastes and requirements, but now I was free to reimagine every room according to my own desires and interests. Harrison called the next morning with updates on the legal proceedings. Elizabeth's bail is set at $50,000, he reported. Since all her accounts are frozen as proceeds of fraud, she'll have to find someone else to post it for her, which might prove challenging given her current circumstances. What about Richard? I asked. $200,000, he replied with evident satisfaction. Apparently, the judge wasn't impressed with his history of securities violations and document fraud. Did you know your son-in-law had been under investigation for investment fraud for the past 2 years? I certainly hadn't known about Richard's criminal activities, but then again, I had been excluded from most family financial discussions over the years. Elizabeth and Richard had always spoken to me like I was a child when money topics came up, simplifying concepts they assumed I couldn't understand, patronizing me about investment strategies and business decisions. They were about to learn exactly how much I had actually understood about their real characters and capabilities. "Harrison," I said, "I want to make some changes to the house." Elizabeth had contractors lined up to renovate several rooms according to her vision. I'd like to proceed with some of those construction plans, but with modifications that reflect my preferences instead of hers. "Excellent idea, Margaret," he replied. "It's your home now, completely and legally. Do whatever makes you happy, whatever helps you build the life you want to live." What made me happy, I realized, was the idea of undoing every assumption Elizabeth had made about my inheritance and my capabilities. She had planned to gut the kitchen, replace all the hardwood floors, and convert Harold's study into a wine cellar for entertaining Richard's business associates. Instead, I was going to turn the study into an art studio where I could rediscover my love of painting, something I had abandoned when I got married, and assume the role of supporting wife and devoted mother, and convert her planned wine cellar into a library where I could finally read all the books I had never had time for during my decades of domestic service. Over the following weeks, word of Elizabeth and Richard's arrests began to spread through our social circle and the broader community. In a city of our size, the arrest of a prominent investment banker and his wife for defrauding his elderly mother-in-law was definitely newsworthy, and the story began to attract attention from local media outlets interested in elder abuse and family financial crimes. "Mrs. Thompson," said Janet Cooper from Channel 7 News when she called, "we understand you're the victim of a significant elder fraud case involving your own daughter. Would you be willing to share your story with our viewers? Your experience could help other seniors recognize the warning signs of family financial abuse and protect themselves from similar situations." She had a compelling point that I hadn't initially considered. How many other women my age were being systematically manipulated by adult children who saw them as inconvenient obstacles to inheritance rather than as human beings deserving of respect and dignity? If my story could help even one person recognize the signs of elder abuse and take action to protect themselves, perhaps some good could come from the nightmare Elizabeth had put me through. "Miss Cooper," I said after considering her proposal, "if I decided to tell my story publicly, would I have control over how it's presented? I want to make sure the focus remains on education and prevention, rather than just sensationalism." "Absolutely," she assured me. "We could arrange a sit-down interview where you would have approval over the final edit, and we could focus on the warning signs, the legal resources available, and the importance of seniors knowing their rights in these situations." I thought about Elizabeth, probably sitting in a jail cell at that moment, still believing this was all some kind of misunderstanding that her charm and manipulation could eventually resolve. The idea of her watching me on television, telling the entire community exactly what she had done and how it had backfired, held a certain poetic justice that appealed to the part of me that had been suppressed for far too many years. "Miss Cooper," I said, "let me think about it and get back to you. I might indeed have quite a story to tell." After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of the expensive wine Richard had sent us for Christmas. Wine that I was now drinking in my own house, purchased with my own inheritance, while contemplating whether to publicly humiliate my daughter on television. Life had certainly taken some interesting turns in the past few months. 6 months later, I was standing in the completely renovated kitchen of my house, making coffee for my financial advisor and preparing for our quarterly review of investment performance and philanthropic planning. The morning sun streamed through new windows that actually opened properly, illuminating countertops I had chosen myself for the first time in 43 years of marriage. "Good morning, Margaret," said Dr. Sarah Williams, my new financial advisor, as she appeared in the doorway carrying a thick folder of reports and recommendations. "Ready for our quarterly review?" The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and personal transformation that had changed every aspect of my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Elizabeth and Richard were each serving 18-month federal sentences in minimum security facilities, and the news coverage of their crimes had made me something of a celebrity in senior advocacy circles across the country. "Your portfolio is performing excellently," Sarah reported as we settled at my new breakfast table. "The charitable foundation is fully operational, and the scholarship fund has already selected its first recipients for next year." The Margaret Thompson Foundation for Elder Protection had become my primary focus, using $15 million of my inheritance to fund legal aid for seniors facing family financial abuse and to support legislative changes designed to strengthen elder protection laws nationwide. "Any word on the documentary?" I asked. "Netflix confirmed the production deal," Sarah replied. "They want to start filming next month." My story had captured media attention far beyond the initial local news coverage, and The Mother's Revenge, an American Crime Story, was being developed as a limited series, with all proceeds designated for elder advocacy organizations. "And Elizabeth?" Sarah's expression grew careful as she consulted her notes. "Her lawyer says she's written again, requesting a meeting to discuss reconciliation and asking for your forgiveness. Elizabeth had written me 23 letters from federal prison over the past 6 months. I had read the first few, which ranged from self-justifying to desperate to manipulative, before deciding to stop opening them entirely. Some relationships, once broken by fundamental betrayal, cannot be repaired with words alone, regardless of how carefully those words are chosen or how much time passes. "Sarah," I said, "has my position on that changed since our last discussion?" "Not according to our previous conversations," she replied diplomatically. "But people do evolve and change, Margaret, even people who have made terrible choices. Prison can be transformative for some individuals." I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago, grieving, dependent, accepting whatever scraps of dignity my family chose to offer me, convinced that my only value lay in my usefulness to others. That woman might have felt obligated to forgive Elizabeth, to rebuild their relationship based on guilt and family tradition, and the assumption that mothers should always sacrifice themselves for their children's benefit. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, who refused to be manipulated by sentiment or social expectations, who had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the full consequences of their choices without interference or rescue. "Sarah," I said, "schedule a meeting with Elizabeth's attorney, not to discuss reconciliation, but to make something very clear to my daughter." "What kind of message?" she asked. "I want Elizabeth to understand that her actions had consequences beyond legal punishment. I want her to know that she destroyed our relationship permanently and completely, and that her children will grow up knowing exactly why their mother went to prison and what kind of person she chose to become when she thought no one was watching." "That seems rather harsh," Sarah observed. "Good," I replied. "It's supposed to be harsh. Elizabeth made adult choices that hurt people she was supposed to love and protect. She doesn't get to escape the emotional and social consequences just because she served her time and written some letters from prison. After Sarah left, I walked through my house, really seeing it as mine now, decorated according to my taste, organized around my priorities and interests rather than around the needs and preferences of other people. In the art studio that had once been Harold's den, I uncovered my latest painting, a self-portrait of a woman standing in bright sunlight, her face turned confidently toward the future. The woman in that painting looked nothing like the grieving widow who had packed her life into 2 suitcases 6 months ago. This woman looked powerful, independent, unafraid, someone who had learned that the best revenge isn't getting even with people who have wronged you. The best revenge is becoming everything your enemies never thought you could be, building a life so rich and meaningful that their opinions and manipulations become completely irrelevant to your happiness and success. Outside my windows, the sun was setting behind trees I had planted myself in soil that belonged to me, on property I had defended through intelligence and courage rather than inherited through marriage or circumstance. Tomorrow, I would continue building the life I had chosen rather than the life others had planned for me. And if Elizabeth wanted to rebuild a relationship with this version of Margaret Thompson, she would need to bring much more than prison letters and hollow apologies. She would need to bring a complete transformation of her character, one that matched the completeness of my own metamorphosis from victim to victor. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey of betrayal, discovery, and ultimate justice. If this story has inspired you or taught you something about protecting yourself and your loved ones from financial abuse, please subscribe and share it with others who might benefit from hearing it. I'll be back soon with more stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when life tested them in ways they never expected. Until then, remember that you're stronger than you think, smarter than others might assume, and capable of more than you've ever imagined. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise.